I have a very special guest with me today, none other than Ray McGovern. Ray is a former CIA analyst. He worked in the CIA in the 1980s and prepared the president's daily brief. And in protest of the CIA's involvement in torture, Ray returned his intelligence commendation medal in 2006 that he got after retirement. And he also co-founded Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity's, VIPS, in 2003. And his website is raymcgovern.com, so please do check it out. Ray, thank you for taking the time to do the interview. It's great to have you back on again.
You're most welcome, Richard. Glad to be with you.
I first wanted to touch on the passing of Daniel Ellsberg. He died a few days ago at age 92. He was also your friend. Could you maybe just share with us how you first met him, and how you first got to know him?
Well, I'll keep it short. It's a long story. When the Iraq War broke out, despite all of our warnings that there were no weapons of mass destruction there and that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, contrary to how our populace was propagandized, I got a call from a professor at American University. It was 3 days after the war started. He said, "Ray, we're going to have this teach-in, just like Vietnam. I would like you to talk about the falsification of intelligence before the attack. Could you do that?" I said, "Well, of course I can do that, but how much time do you have?" And he says, 10 minutes. 10 minutes better than nothing, right? So I show up there. The person before me was a fellow named Daniel Ellsberg. I had not met him before, but he was already a hero of mine, okay? And what he said, I remember it distinctly, was not, "I'm Daniel Ellsberg, and I was right about Vietnam, and I warned." I said, "You know what he said?" He said, "Don't do what I did." I waited too long. I knew in 1964 that we were being lied to in this war. I knew chapter and verse because I was in the inside. And I waited until 1971, when the bombs had long since started to fall, when all the lies were coming to fruition. Don't do what I did. Don't wait. Do it now. Do it courageously. Do it at whatever personal risk you may incur, but do it now before the battle rages, and you could save a whole bunch of lives. And if you face some imprisonment, well, it's still worth it to prevent the slaughter that I've seen with my own eyes and that others have seen on active duty. He also warned more recently that that asking people to make the sacrifice of blowing the whistle from the inside and running the risk of the rest of their life in prison, Dan said it's worth it. Now, that's easy to say, except for one person, that is Dan Ellsberg. It wasn't easy for him to say, but when he marched up to that interview before the trial, they asked him, are you thinking about spending the rest of your life in prison? And he just instinctively said, "Wouldn't you do that? Wouldn't you do that to prevent this war?" Hello? So what I'm saying here is that Daniel Ellsberg was the paragon, was the model for all other whistleblowers. And we have a whistleblower society, so to speak. It's called the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity. We have 21 years of experience. We started with Colleen Rowley of the FBI. We've had Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning and Cy Hirsch. And we gave our most recent award to Daniel Ellsberg. Now, it was after he had told everybody, not everybody, but we knew about his pancreatic cancer. So on April 11th, we had a very small ceremony in his home with someone representing Sam Adams. And you could tell that Dan was not well. As a matter of fact, our representative had lunch with him and said, I was really concerned that Dan would be able to do this because he wasn't real good over lunch. Well, he was eloquent. And at the very end, last 3 minutes, he summoned up the rest of his strength and he said, don't do what I did. Don't do it. Do it now. Do it before the bombs start falling. How moving that is, you know? And so that was the portion that in my most recent article, I pushed, because there are people within the British government now, depleted uranium shells, for God's sake. There are people in the American government that know what's planned, for example, against China. We could get into a two-front war. Those people need to know that Dan Ellsberg speaks with some authority when he says, don't do what I did in waiting, and be prepared. Make the sacrifice. You're a human being. If you can prevent the slaughter of thousands of other human beings, do it.
Yeah, Ray,
he was also a friend of mine.
You answered my second question. I was actually going to ask you exactly about this point that Dan Ellsberg said that whistleblowers shouldn't wait too long. So despite his bravery, he's still he's still very humble and says that he should have done it earlier, which I think says a lot about his character.
Yeah, Richard, there's a codicil to that, which I probably owe to your audience. He did prevent worse in Vietnam. He did do that before 1971 with the Pentagon Papers. It's a really interesting story. I could tell it about 2 minutes. Is that okay?
Please do, by all means.
Okay. Well, Dan had been in Vietnam. He was a Marine, for God's sake. And even after he became a civilian, he went there to see what it was like and came back and said, this is a god-awful thing. Somebody's got to do something about this, okay? So we get to 1967. I'm working on Soviet foreign policy toward Vietnam, toward China, toward the whole part of Asia. And my friend Sam Adams is working on finding out how many Viet Cong there are under arms in South Vietnam. Guess what? No one had done that before. We're talking 1965, 66, 67. They were still working from the French records from the French Indo-Chinese War. Okay. So Sam got all these intercepts and all these aerial photographs and everything else together and spy reports and said, wow, there are between 500 and 600,000 Viet Communists, if you will, under arms in South Vietnam. And everybody said, my God, that can't be right, Sam. Why not? Because General Westmoreland in Saigon says there can't be more than 299,000. Whoa. Now, I could tell you the reason for that, but it'd be better for me to explain it using the words of General Creighton Abrams. Abrams? Yeah, right. He has a tank named after him.
Right.
Was he a good tanker? Patton said that Abrams was almost as good as Patton. Okay. Does Abrams know much about political affairs? Well, listen to this little story. I'm having lunch with Sam Adams. It's August 20th, 1967. And I'm saying, Sam, for God's sake, your numbers are correct. You've pored over this. You've had all our colleagues look them over. Why? Why in God's name would a general running a war de-emphasize or make short the count of the enemy? I mean, they inflate it, right? He says, Ray, you won't believe this, but this morning there was a notice came in from General Abrams in Saigon. Abrams was General Westmoreland's deputy, okay? Miss Westmoreland was traveling somewhere, so Abrams wrote the cable. And this is what Abrams says, Sam tells me. He said, we can't possibly go with Sam Adams's numbers, however accurate they may be, because we have been projecting an image of success in this war. And there is no amount of caveats that we could possibly adduce to prevent the press in Saigon from drawing an erroneous and gloomy conclusion. That's a direct quote. Now,
Wow.
I should have asked Sam if I could have a copy of that cable. I should have given it to the New York Times. I didn't. That's another story, okay? But I said, wow, Sam, there it is, right in black and white. Why do you suppose he'd do that? Because he's a good tanker and he's a lousy politician. There it is, right on the record, okay? Now, what happens? Sam fights the good fight. He lines up every other intelligence agency in Washington to agree to his numbers, except, of course, the Army, Westmoreland being an Army general, and they go to the acme of the intelligence profession, the National Intelligence Estimate process. I know that. I shared a couple of estimates myself. This is a big deal. Finally, at the last stage, the director of Central Intelligence, in charge of all these agencies, gets them all together and says, all right, gentlemen, it was in those days, it was all gentlemen. All right, gentlemen, here we have this estimate. What do you think? Oh, yeah, all kinds of executives from the Army, okay? So what does Director Richard Helms do? He says, well, we'll take it off the table. How does he explain that to Sam Adams? He said, look, Sam, my job is to protect the CIA. And I can't protect the CIA if we get involved in a pissing match with the U.S. Army at war. So forget about it.
Oh, man.
That was August 1967. Now, late January 1968, the Tet Offensive, countrywide offensive, every hamlet, village, province, whatever you have in Vietnam, that cities, Saigon, are attacked. By how many people? Well, actually, it seemed to be about 600,000, right? Okay. So what happens? Well, people in the Pentagon, people at CIA finally had to tell LBJ, look, we've been undercounting the number of enemy. It doesn't look really good. People will claim that Ted was a defeat for the VC because we survived, but nobody's going to buy that.
Right.
The jig is sort of up, but Westmoreland is in Washington saying, look, all I need is 206,000 more troops. That's all I need. Okay. And we'll go to Laos and Cambodia. Maybe we'll go up into North Vietnam. Up to China. We can do it. All I need is 206,000 more, 206,000 more troops. Yeah. And we won't get involved in nuclear. I know you don't want nuclear LBJ, but we can do it, right? So what happened? It all comes to a head. And what Les Gelb, we only learned this later, and most people won't know who Les Gelb was. He was number 3 in the Defense Department. He came out of the Bronx. He's a New Yorker, and he knows which end is up, and he knows how to be honest. He leaks to Neil Sheehan and Rick Smith of the New York Times the notion that Westmoreland is seeking 206,000 more troops. Whoa! It goes up on I think it was the 9th of February. No, the 9th of March, right after the Tet thing was over. Big headline, big major story, okay? Now, the reason I mention all this is Dan Ellsberg, he knew Sam Adams. He met him in Vietnam when Sam was there in one of his trips. But Dan Ellsberg looks at this and says, my God, he didn't know it was Les Gelb, who happened to be a good friend of Ellsberg. But my God, somebody has leaked Westmoreland's numbers. And there's a big to-do about, what we should do now. Why don't I leak Sam Adams' numbers? Why don't I tell the American people that the agency, the CIA, had statistics, had analysis showing there were between 500 and 600,000 troops and that was falsified by the military. Why did I go ahead and do that? He did it. That was Dan Ellsberg's very first leak. Okay, he leaked it 10 days after Les Gelb did the Westmoreland request. Okay, what happens 1 week later? LBJ convenes a small group of confidants and says, "We've had it. Nobody trusts us anymore. I would have given Westy those 206,000 men, but the leaks have hurt us beyond repair. We're not going to do it. Tell Westy no. Tell Westy to come home. We'll make him head Army Chief of Staff, for God's sake. Tell him to come home. And besides, next week, I'm going to declare that I'm not going to run for president again." Wow. That all happened within 1 month. Okay. March of 2000, I'm sorry, March of 1968, after the Tet Offensive. So just to close this thing up, why do I cite that? Because Dan told that story in his book. I should have it here. The book is called Secrets, okay? It's here somewhere. And I read, he gave me that. He gave me a nice little inscription after our meeting there at American University. And I read the damn thing through, and I said, "Well, wait a second, Dan. And it's not like you didn't speak up before 1971. You prevented Westmoreland going up to the Chinese border, for God's sake, in 1968. And you know what happens when you go up to the Chinese border? Hello, anybody who knows about Korea knows about that. Okay, so I said, right. Dan, this is really good. So I confirmed it with him. That was really the case. And in the citation accompanying the Sam Adams Award for Integrity, I wrote up that sequence of events. And when he was faced with it in receiving the award, he said, "Oh, wow, I remember that." And since then, I found out it was Les Gelb that made that encouraged me to do my thing with Sam Adams statistics. And I didn't think you'd focus on this, but yeah, that was my first leak. So, long story short, but it shows what I call felicitous, lucky, well-timed leaks can do. And to his last breath, virtually, Dan Ellsberg was saying precisely that. Do it now. Let people know at your own risk, but my God, thousands of people may be spared because of your courage.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, that's the first takeaway, and the second is that it's funny how just a handful of people can play with politics and lie to each other. In the same country. It's it's a. I wanted to ask you, Ray, before we get into the Ukraine and the rest of it. Just how does the CIA recruit people? How do they develop assets, right? Because I mean, I know you have people that are threatened, others that are paid off. But how did you end up working as an analyst for them? And what about assets that are developed? Could you get into that for us?
Well, Richard, I hate to say it because it betrays my age, but I suppose looking at me does the same. In 1960, I had been majoring in Russian because I loved it. It was just fun, and I taught it later. And little did I know that the Berlin Wall would fall, and that eventually, but the crisis at Checkpoint Charlie would take shape, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, all that stuff. In other words, little did I know that I would be prepared to make a special contribution, being fluent in Russian, and my master's was in history and Russian history and Russian area studies, they called it at the time. So when John Kennedy got up on his inauguration and said, look, we got a fresh new look here in Washington. Come on down and do something for your country. Don't be asking what your country can do for you.
Yeah.
Now, that didn't sound corny in those days, Richard. It didn't sound corny at all. And there were a whole bunch of thousands of us, thousands of us came down thinking we had something special to contribute. And my Russian background was that something. So I contacted the CIA representative whose telephone number was in the New York phone book, for God's sake. They didn't recruit at Fordham. They recruited at Yale and Harvard and Tufts and people who are the best and the brightest, the kind of Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan kind, or the kinds like those fellas that were the best and the brightest in Vietnam. So it was a little odd that I kind of applied, but they said, "Oh, you've got a pretty good record. Oh, you speak Russian? Yeah, we'll take this test, all-day test." Little vignette, all-day test, all day. And then I was playing for Fordham basketball. We had to play Army that night, and I fouled out at the end. We lost by 2 points, but it was it was a long day for me. Anyhow, I passed muster. They let me complete my military duty, 2 years as an Army intelligence, infantry intelligence officer. Learned a lot doing that. And then, of course, there was a natural progression into the analytic ranks of CIA. They gave me a portfolio right off the bat that I couldn't have dreamed of. It was relations between Russia and China, Russia and Vietnam, Russia and Japan, the whole East, and the international communist movement. Man, it was just a terrific thing. And in those early days, we were able to follow what President Truman, who set up the CIA, really wanted. Now, what he wanted was what he called untainted intelligence. Okay, untreated was the actual word he used. Tell it like it is. You work for me. You don't work for the State Department. You don't work for the Pentagon. You work for me. I control your career. You tell me what you really think. We were able to do that, at least in Soviet foreign policy terms, until Casey and Gates came in the 80s. Then it became much more difficult. And I finally left in 1990 when the Soviet Union had imploded. I patted myself on the back and said, well, not just you, Ray, but we worked real hard to do it, and left to work down in the inner city of Washington in the full expectation that George H.W. Bush's vision would be completed. That is, a Europe free and secure from Lisbon to Vladivostok. You know what happened after that when Clinton came in. So that was how I got in, how I went out. The place has been totally corrupted now. It used to be the analysis division and the operations people. They're all mixed together now, and the analysis people are no better than the people who run the operations. Witness they go along with this blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, for God's sake. Anybody in our day would have told the director of Central Intelligence or director of CIA, Bill Burns, look, this is a cockamamie thing. Yeah, big deal that you can do it. Think about the next day, huh? So
Right.
There's none of that now. And I have been saying openly that whereas before I was reluctant to throw the analysis division out with the bathwater, okay? Right now, I think the whole thing should be disestablished, set up an analysis unit somewhere else in the government, okay? Independent as possible, and let those people blow up stuff and assassinate people. Let them work somewhere else, maybe the Pentagon. They don't belong in an intelligence analysis agency.
I mean, the day the Nord Stream pipeline attack happened, the first thing I said, it's either Britain or America. It's one of the two, or together basically. And Russia, they have the capability, but why would they blow up their own pipeline? And I mean, what did you think of this? I think you kind of just gave me your thoughts on this attack, but also the lack of response from European countries. Like they're so scared to criticize NATO and the US. It's astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, just to pick up on the blowing up of the pipeline and the blowing up or destruction of that dam there in Ukraine, to claim that the Russians were responsible, let's say, for the dam, would be to say that it didn't occur to them, if they want to flood that thing, they could have just, opened the sluices, They have to blow up the damn thing. They have an incredibly powerful lever here. Why blow it up? Just let the waters out if you like. Put it back the. So
same thing
you
with
have
the
to believe that.
pipeline. They can just, they did turn it off.
took the words right out of my mouth. Of course, the pipeline. They had turned it off, but it could easily have been turned back on, and so why deprive yourself of that leverage? Now, you asked me something else. Now I got so excited about the pipeline that it escapes me at the moment.
No, it's I was hinting at the lack of response from European countries, because Denmark, Germany, and Norway were all conducting investigations as if they don't know.
Well, you remember that wonderful cartoon with the lemmings, these little animals, at the edge of the cliff, and they're looking down, and one lemming says to the other one, "Oh, do we really have to do this?" And the second one says, "To do anything less would be to betray the history of our lemmingness." So I know Germany real well. I lived there for 5 years, worked there for 5 years, and I could say the trite thing like some of my best friends are Germans, and they are. But my God, when are they going to grow up, for God's sake? Now, my friend Gil Doctorow has written a wonderful piece showing that the evolution, or I would say devolution, of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, just started just shortly after Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr had such a good thing going with their Ostpolitik toward Russia. And this is just a culmination of a bunch of hacks, political hacks, that don't know much about the world, and are going to really incur incredible damage to the German economy and everything else. So let me just say one more word about why these allies, we all say allies and partners. We got allies and partners. Okay. Now, I was asked to brief the UN Security Council back in late February. And so, sure, that sounds like good. Jeffrey Sachs did it remotely, big screen there. And then I was able to be there in person. I flew up in the morning, flew back at night. And right before that resolution was discussed, the resolution being, this is an act of war blowing up this pipeline. Should we not have a Security Council authorized investigation? And the Russians were pleading for that. And they got this resolution. And that morning, every one of the Security Council members got a memo from the governments of Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. And what did that memo say? Don't worry about it. We've got it covered. We are doing a thorough investigation of this. So no need for a Security Council to get involved with us. Leave it to us.
Sure thing.
That's the way. Well, as Jeffrey Sachs pointed out earlier, the Swedes had already investigated. If the Swedes know every inch of the Baltic, or the sand under the Baltic, right?
Yeah.
And so they sent down the divers, and the divers came up. Oh, yeah. Well, what'd you find? We can't tell you. It's a secret. National security. We won't even tell our Swedish citizens. Right. So that happened in September, for God's sake, when the thing was blown up. Or October.
Yeah, and they buried it in the media. Like there were several months. I mean, even until now, they don't talk about it. It's just I've never seen a terrorist attack, disappear that fast from the media.
But the interesting thing was that at that meeting, which I briefed, and my shtick was mostly just to combat people who were disparaging, blaming Cy Hirsch for being incompetent. Just the opposite was the case, and I could prove it. Okay. So at that meeting, Russia made this case, and we really should investigate. The Chinese weighed in really heavily. So, of course, what's this place for if you don't investigate an active war like this? And the Brazilian representative was three men to the left of me. He had no firm instructions, and so he was sort of wishy-washy. And the end analysis, which was really interesting to me, when I saw the results, watching it on some program, it was 3 votes for Russia, China, and Brazil. How many votes against? No votes against. Oh, wow! What's going on here? 12 abstentions. A new record for abstentions.
It
In other
is.
words, it's just too embarrassing to vote against an investigation that's clearly warranted. So the U.S. persuaded the Brits and everybody else, why don't we just abstain, So
Yeah.
that's what happened to that resolution.
Wow.
They're trying to revive it now. But, the UN is so much under the U.S. heel that I'm surprised on occasion that the Russians and the Chinese continue to play ball with it.
Yeah.
I don't think the Russians would, were they not to have firm partners in the Chinese and growing partners like the Brazilians and the Iranians and others now that are coming to the fore. So anyhow, that's how it ended up. And when you looked at that vote, and you look at not 3 to 12, but you look at the populations represented
That's
by
true.
these votes, it's the majority of the world, no problem.
Right.
And so to talk about the U.S. isolating Russia, I mean, hello, it's just the opposite. These policies
Yeah.
have left the world. Now, Richard, this is important, so I'll say it. Important to me anyway. We're left now with a lily white West
Yeah.
against the rest of the world. That's not good. People talk about a triangular, multilateral thing, okay, but it's
Right.
really bilateral. It's white people against the rest of the world. Almost all of them, most of them, people of color. And I remember, while I have the floor here, Rudyard Kipling had something special to say about this. He said, "It is not wise for the Christian white to hustle the Asian brown. For the Christian riles, the Asian smiles, and he weareth the Christian down. At the end of the fight lies a tombstone white, with the name of the late deceased, and the epitaph drear, a fool lies here who tried to hustle the East." If that's what Blinken is doing today in Beijing, I wish him a lot of luck, because he ain't going to hustle the East.
Yeah. I mean, look at the population numbers, like you mentioned. If we look at just the BRICS countries alone, it's the, it's they talk about isolating Russia, but if we look at the votes in the UN General Assembly, most of the world, they're either, how should we put this? They're not necessarily with Russia, but they're definitely not against Russia. Okay, so they're abstaining and either abstaining or voting in favor of Russia, it shows you it's just a minority in the global North, as we call it today, versus global South.
On that point, Richard, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in an interview just this past week, talked about consulting with African nations and others who have always been under the U.S. heel or under the Western heel. And he said, I asked them to explain why they had to abstain and why they just couldn't vote against the U.S. And they said, well, it's just too difficult. We just can't do it. And Lavrov says, so I asked them, well, what would be the repercussions if you didn't vote like the U.S. wanted you to vote, or you didn't abstain when they insisted you abstain? And one of the high diplomats said, well, then they wouldn't punish us. then we wouldn't be punished. Well, that day is over, folks.
Yeah.
And, you know, it could be welcomed, except there's still a very real danger that these crazy people in Washington will not see the light, still think that they're exceptional or even indispensable, and let loose the dogs of war.
I mean, Ray, all of the years that you spent working in Washington and you know in Langley, I mean, you look at the Cold War and what's happening now. Drone striking the Kremlin, you know, a few weeks ago. This is unthinkable, even in the Cold War, and now it's like it's just normal. How do you look at this, having gone through the Cold War? You know, would you agree that it's insanity?
Well, we have Mr. Putin himself, who has described our policymakers as crazy. And that's worth probably quoting. Back in October at Valdai, the discussion group, he was asked a question, Mr. President Putin, why do you suppose the U.S. policymakers are taking on China at the same time as they're taking us on in Ukraine?
Mm-hmm.
And Putin says, well, I tried to see some logic in that, but I have to say, I think they're crazy. Putin's word. I thought that there might be some subtle plan there, but I no longer think so. I think it's a function of arrogance and a feeling of impunity, end quote. Now, I happen to agree with Putin on that. I think it's a feeling of arrogance, feeling of impunity, and this whole thing about being exceptional. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I think, for God's sake. What matters is what Putin thinks. Now, if he thinks he's up against a bunch of crazy people, I mean, okay, so he's talking to his generals, and they're saying, well, what do you think? What plan should we? They've got to be on tenterhooks. I mean, they've got to be super ready for crazy people to act in a crazy manner.
You know, the diplomats and the people making policy decisions, do you think they have lost touch with reality? Because I feel like there's a great disparity between the people that you had running the U.S., let's say 40 years ago, and now. And I don't mean that they are no longer imperialists, but that at least in the Cold War they understood there's a balance of power that needs to be respected, and now it's just perhaps arrogance, like you described it.
Well, this is a first. You're quite right in stressing this or emphasizing it, Richard. Even during the Cold War, there was a just a sensible agreement, unwritten, that you don't put another nuclear power up against the wall. Okay. John Kennedy said it in that wonderful, wonderful American University speech. He said, you don't want to face an opponent into where he has no other choice than to launch a war against you, nuclear war. That's what we avoid. Now, up until Ukraine, pretty much we avoided that. Sure, we sent submarines into Soviet and Russian waters and all that kind of stuff, and the warships and the Marines had played their games in the covert action people.
Yeah,
but to put a country with its back up against the wall, which is what our esteemed Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said, we want to weaken Russia. And, what Rand has said in their papers, and what actually it was the Defense Intelligence Agency, the last time anybody heard from them, a year after the coup in Kiev, said, and this is a virtual quote, the Russians interpret that coup as a strike against their government and the first step in removal of Vladimir Putin and regime change in Russia. That is the consequence. That is the conclusion that they draw from that. Now, that was in a congressionally mandated paper that was sent to Congress And of course, never publicized in any of the media, but DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, had it right. What happened? They were cut out of all this other stuff about Russiagate. Just one little detail here. DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, had the portfolio for the Russian Defense Intelligence Agency called the GRU. The CIA wanted to accuse this GRU of hacking into the Democratic National Committee, right?
Right.
So what was DIA's role in that? Nothing. DIA didn't play in this game. They weren't allowed to. Why? Because they made that big mistake in 2016 of telling the truth about how the Russians were doing. Now, anyhow, the intramural stuff in Washington has been almost unbelievable ever since 2016, when we found deep state interference in that election and the 2020 election. It's out there. I can prove it. So can anybody else who's paying attention. You won't be able to get it from major media, least of all the New York Times. However documentary, however court testify, however under the oath it came. So that's the real danger. Americans have been so brainwashed on how to hate Putin, how to hate Russians for 7 years now, that I dare say, if Biden tried to wamp up some support for some sort of intervention with U.S. armed forces in Ukraine, most of the Americans say, oh, mean against that Hitler Putin, oh, we better move now. We can't do a Munich again. So it's just really, I mean, that is the fearsome thing that people have been so uneducated that they'd be putty in the hands of people who wanted to be a demagogue and say, yeah, we got to take on the Russians now. And what happened then?
In Europe, it's the same thing. I mean, reading French media or listening to French media, German media, it's just copy paste from British and American tabloids. Truly, just copy paste it, and there's no difference in analysis. It's the same like anti-Russia fervor, and they've been doing it for years, right? It's the same thing. It's crazy.
Yeah,
it's really crazy. I wonder. Back then, at least, when just internally speaking, so this is in the CIA and so on, didn't people have this implicit understanding that as you mentioned, going after Soviet satellite states or shall we say former Soviet Union like Ukraine, and with the salami tactic, that it's going to be considered like like your Russian version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, shall we say, where it's you're putting a nuclear power up against the wall, like this JFK speech that you quoted. Didn't people understand this on the inside, at least?
They did. Yeah, we did. And we had a direct in on the policy making there while I was there in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So, it's very dangerous now, because what you have in place the kinds of people in the CIA that Bill Casey and Bobby Gates, who later became defense secretary, they let these people bubble up to the top, not because of any experience in international affairs, but because they saluted when they needed to. Will the Communist Party of the Soviet Union ever relinquish power without a fight? No, sir. Right answer. Okay. Now, I was fortunate enough to be in a position where I didn't have to answer directly to those people. And the people I was dealing with downtown with the president's daily brief. I could answer them honestly, based not only on my own experience, but on the experience of other Soviet experts who were not under the direct tutelage or the direct control of Bobby Gates and Bill Casey. But the point is that those people kind of slithered to the top. They became so prevalent that by the time Iraq came along, And Dick Cheney said, "Look, you will give this legend about
Yeah.
weapons of mass destruction." Then they said, "Well, we're malleable managers. We could do that for the next promotion, or if you want to make a war, that might be fun." I mean, it was just awful to see that, because many of those people, I knew many of those people. I knew many of the people who filed in behind Gina Haspel, the torturer in chief, and supported her in becoming the new head of the CIA. I couldn't abide it. I stood up and I interrupted the proceedings in the Senate, and of course paid the price for that. But you have to stand up and you have to call attention to these things, no matter what the cost.
Yeah, Ukraine's counteroffensive, it doesn't seem to be going too well. I'm pretty sure you saw these pictures and videos of columns of tanks just burning, and specifically these are Bradleys. So these are Bradleys and Leopards, American and German tanks, respectively. I mean, this was hyped up for a long time, this counteroffensive, and they used it to justify the delivery of all of these sophisticated weapon systems. So, first it was even Germany, which was supposed to be a peaceful country. They were saying, okay, we'll give some helmets, and then okay, we'll give some tanks, and now they're talking about planes. What do you make of this counteroffensive and how it's going for Ukraine? It doesn't look too good, does it?
It looks just as bad as most of us predicted. Those of us with our heads screwed on right. The sad thing is that you have the General Abrams back. You've got General Westmoreland back. You've got political generals. Now take Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. When he was head of CENTCOM, the command that has purview over the Near East, 51, no, I'm not sure that, it was over 50 intelligence analysts filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General of the Pentagon saying he is falsifying our conclusions on Syria and on other aspects of what's going on in the Near East. We object. We're not going to abide this anymore. Over 50 intelligence analysts risking their own careers? Yeah, exactly. They were down in Tampa. You remember that, okay? So what happened? Well, there was a Pentagon investigation that resembled all other Pentagon investigations of 4 stars, right? You have a 2-star investigating 4-star, you're going to get the predictable result, right? So where's Austin now? What is Austin telling the president now? So I think it's not any longer just dumb. I think it's unconscionable that so many people are getting killed in Ukraine now because of falsification of numbers, just as with General Abrams and General Westmoreland out there in Vietnam so many years ago. And it was all terribly predictable. I mean, we know about the Russians. We know how strongly they feel about all this. And not only the war on the ground here, you mentioned something before that should not be neglected, and I'll take a couple of minutes to do that. You said something like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, many people don't know that these medium-range cruise missiles, offensive missiles put on ships, have also been put on territory in Romania and Poland. Okay, violation of the INF Treaty. Of course, that's why we got out of the INF Treaty. Okay, so these things are in capsules, and they're on ships, and they're in the same capsules on ground, Romania and Poland. Well, what does that mean? That means if you look at these things, they look like pillboxes, right? Like the things you take in the morning if you're my age, right? You open up, you take a pill, right? Okay. Well, what's under there? They don't know. It could be an anti-ship missile, as in these destroyers. It could be a surface-to-air missile, but it could also be a cruise missile. Okay. Now, if it's a cruise missile, what did Mr. Putin warn about that? He said on December 21st, 2021. Look it up. He was speaking to all his highest military brass. He said, look, if a cruise missile is under one of those capsules that we can't see beneath, it can reach Moscow in between 7 and 10 minutes. Okay. Now, they'll eventually get hypersonic missiles. Then it will be 5. Count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 minutes. Okay. Now, why do I mention that? That's fact. You don't get that in the New York Times. I did a whole briefing on this on, say, April 25th for the Community Church in Boston. You can see it on my website. So why is it so important? Well, because that's precisely the reason that John Kennedy did an act of war when Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba. An act of war, yeah. He called it a quarantine, but it was a blockade, okay? Did Fidel Castro have the right to have those missiles and to join any alliance that he wanted to join? Of course he did. Screw that. We had an existential threat. We had missiles already in Cuba that could reach Washington, Norfolk, Savannah, even the Omaha, Nebraska, where the Strategic Air Command was. And guess how many? 7 minutes, 10 minutes, okay? Norfolk, 5 minutes, okay? So what did JFK do? They said, look, Khrushchev, we've got an existential threat here. I'm gonna threaten to use whatever we got. My advisors are begging me to obliterate all you people. And we have a little team in Key West that's ready to go into Cuba. So take those missiles out of there. Take them out now. Now, Khrushchev compared notes with his military, and they said, well, do we have an existential threat here? No. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. It was a good try. Take the missiles out. Meanwhile, there was a side deal. Bobby Kennedy, to his credit, was talking to Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador. They worked out a deal that if Russia promised not to mention this,
in Turkey,
missiles from Turkey would be taken out, equivalent missiles.
Yeah.
The Soviets kept their promise. 4 months later, those missiles were taken quietly. Well, not so quietly, but it wasn't viewed as part of the deal, although it was certainly a codicil, right? Okay.
Right.
That's the way we did it then, okay? Was I scared about that? I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, okay? Second Lieutenant, Army Infantry Intelligence. There were no weapons. There were no weapons to train on at the Army Infantry Educational Center, Fort Benning. Where were they? They were all down in Key West, Florida. If I had been a couple of months before, I would have been down in Key West, Florida with those weapons. Okay. So we were ready to go into Cuba. So that was defused. Now, why was that defused? Because there was communication, because there was a modicum of trust. Okay. And because there were people around that John Kennedy could turn to. Not only his brother Bobby, but Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson, who, after George Kennan, was the Soviet expert. He had just come from Moscow, where he had been ambassador, and Kennedy said, Llewellyn, I want you, Tommy is what they call Tommy Thompson. Tommy, I want you to sit in on every meeting having to do with this. Sit in with the Joint Chiefs if they'll let you, but I want you in on every meeting. And finally, it was Thompson that said, look, you have a really harsh cable or teletype from Khrushchev. He's probably writing that with his military behind him. And you have a conciliatory one. So, hey, Mr. President, just answer this one. And that worked. So what's my point here? You know, when you have an existential threat against your country, you're going to do anything to get rid of it. And did John Kennedy break the law? Yes, he did. Did anybody say, oh, come on, President Kennedy, this was unprovoked? No, they didn't. Oh, come on, Kennedy, it was illegal. No, I didn't say that at all, right? Oh, come on, Kennedy, you had other options. He didn't have any other options. Now, am I comparing this with Mr. Putin? Am I daring to compare John F. Kennedy with the situation that Vladimir Putin faced and still faces? Yes, I am. And I do that because I'm an intelligence analyst and because I just look at the facts. I don't make moral judgments, okay? That's how it all went down. And I have tried to explain that for the many, many months now. Look at my website if you like to hear more.
Yeah, it's just logic. It's shocking how devoid of any reason our policymakers and the media are today, because the media is supposed to keep the government in check. There's none of that now. They're just mouthpieces, and they have no understanding of Cold War history or balance of power. And I something else that wasn't covered in the media, which I couldn't find anything. It's the video I sent you of Putin yesterday with the South African delegation holding up a copy of a peace deal signed between Russia and Ukraine last year in spring 2022. And, the Russians had never mentioned it. The Ukrainians had never mentioned it, but they signed it. The Ukrainians signed it, so as did the Russians. But, it looks like they didn't hold up their end of the deal. What did you make of that?
The bottom line on that, Richard, is that the Russians have given up dealing with not only the Ukrainians, but with their sponsors, the U.S. This is very out of character for the Russians and particularly for Putin. This is revealing diplomatic things that are usually kept secret. Now, he hastened to add that there was no agreement to keep this confidential.
I noticed that, yeah.
So that's important. But still, the Russians have been extraordinarily circumspect, in my view, until now, not to reveal really sensitive things that would put the complete kibosh on any prospect of dealing later with the U.S. or with Ukraine or somebody else. But now it's different. Lavrov, the foreign minister, made a point of talking about Minsk and how the Russians were led down the primrose path. I want to quote just two sentences from it because Putin took a lot of heat for this, and uncharacteristically of any Western statesman, and Putin has said, "Yeah, they fooled me. I mean, I shouldn't have bought into that. I shouldn't have stood around for 7 years while they diddled us." Putin himself said that. But here's Lavrov, okay? The Minsk agreements from 2015. Yeah, 2015, 2016. Here we go. Many people believed, this is Lavrov, that Russia made a compromise that did not meet the interests of Ukrainian citizens who associated themselves with the Russian world. One way or another, that compromise was the outcome of diplomacy. However, although the document was unanimously approved at the UN Security Council, the Minsk Accords of 2015, our former partners, 3 signatories, Angela Merkel, François Hollande, and Pyotr Poroshenko, admitted that they had not planned to implement it. So the, quote, diplomacy of lies, end quote, was the only kind of diplomacy we had then. I don't know how the current stage of diplomacy can be defined. Later, he says, we're finished. We're not going to deal with the West anymore. We're turning to the East. Now, that's a terrible, terrible loss for the West. I mean,
it is.
Well, I won't go into that, but this is what they have dealt with, and what Putin is really saying now is that, look, okay, you did this. We should have fixed this thing in 2014 when Donetsk and Lugansk pleaded with us to accept us into the into Russia. And we said, no, work it out. The Minsk Accords, look at them. We'll watch them, and you just try to cooperate. Get some regional autonomy. We don't want you part of Russia. Okay. Well, when push came to shove, and this is what's really interesting. This is another thing that Russia hasn't really been as explicit about as I think it should be. In early March of 2022, after the invasion started, the Russians publicized Ukrainian plans to carry on an offensive in the Donbass into cleaning out what was left of the resistance of Russian-oriented people. They made what's his name, Konashenkov, the military spokesman, made a big deal of this. And we have the Ukrainian plans to go ahead and start this offensive in late February or early March. Well, why do I mention that? Well, people doubt, or people say, well, yeah, there was an uptick of artillery strikes, like in a geometric order of magnitude by Ukrainian offenses, Ukrainian forces against the Donbass. And that was also in February, but we don't know anything about a force that was ready to pounce on it. Well, that's what they said there. There is lots of evidence by very, very good watchers of this, including Jacques Bode of Switzerland. But the Russians never made much of a deal of it. Now, let me give you just a couple other things. I mentioned the 21 December warning from Putin,
when they
saying, "Look, we have these, these offensive strike missiles." Okay, what happened next? Well, as he looked out at those military people, he saw that his claim that we have to have something solid now, something committed to, something written down on paper. These generals and admirals, brighter, I think, than, well, I won't. Comparisons are invidious. They're looking at him and say, "Right, Vladimir Vladimirovich, right? Wasn't the ABM treaty written down? How about the INF treaty, intermediate nuclear? Wasn't that written down? Oh, come on. We need something more than something written down, Vladimir." What happened next? You may not know this, Richard, as closely as you've followed things, but on the 25th of December, Christmas, the Russians announced that they were pulling 10,000 troops off the border with Ukraine. How do I know that? Some enterprising reporter on the New York Post reported that, chapter and verse, citing the Russian source for it. Okay. Now, that was before she got the memo. New York Post, for some reason, is guilty of writing things before they get the memo. Zero. Let me just ask you, Richard, did you know about that withdrawal on the 25th of December?
I know they withdrew troops in spring of 2022, part of this peace deal, right? It's from Kiev, but not this one, no.
Yeah. So you have that speech on the 21st, then you have the 25th, move the troops, okay? And then zero reaction from the United States, not even from anybody but the New York Post. What happens on the 30th of December? On the 30th of December, Putin, Kremlin, calls the White House and says, Mr. Putin wants to talk to Mr. Biden. And they say, okay, well, wait a second. Why? You talked to him earlier in this month, and now our negotiators are getting together in Geneva on the 9th and 10th. Of January. Please, Mr. Putin wants to talk to Mr. Biden. Now, to his credit, Biden takes the call. And what's the upshot of it? Well, in the readout, the Russian readout, it says, this is a quote, Mr. Biden said that the U.S. has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. Whoa! I mentioned, they're already in Romania. They're already
Hmm.
in Poland. Well, okay, we could talk about those later, but this is a big deal. Apparently, Joe Biden was asked to make this commitment, and he did. Okay, so what happens next? New Year's Eve, rejoicing in Moscow. What's his name? Ushakov. Ushakov is the main guy for Putin on this. He's rejoicing. The man, those Geneva negotiations are off to a good start. Man, this is what happens. They go to Geneva on the 9th and 10th of January. The U.S. has no instructions to talk about that. It fell off the table. And the next thing you know, February 12th, the next and I think the last time Biden and Putin talked. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I think it was the most recent time. I think it's the last time that they talked. The readout was Mr. Biden refused to discuss his earlier undertaking about not putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Now, my point here is simply, why haven't the Russians made a bigger deal out of that? The Russians don't falsify readout from summits, for God's sake, you know?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying here is this is a little bit uncharacteristic of the Russians, as I've seen them, and I've watched them for 6 decades now, okay? And Putin, personally, they've given up on it. They're going to release these things to prove their case.
Yeah.
Bit by bit, I think we'll see more coming out with respect to the threat that Putin saw from Ukrainian forces going to Donbass in late February of 2022. In other words, it was partly, at least, a preemptive move so that they didn't get too far. And with all the pressure on Putin, by virtue of the fact that he admitted that he was diddled, that Minsk was always just an excuse. And, people should know that when I mentioned Merkel and Hollande and
Yeah.
Poroshenko, they said it. They said it themselves. This is just a way of delaying so we could get the Ukrainian army built up really well. And not only, they didn't say, oh, no, they said, yeah, that's pretty good, huh? The way to diddle Putin. So
They're proud of it.
Putin, I think, is under some hardline pressure from his own folks, and I find it sort of really refreshing that he feels that he has enough power to say, okay, I blew that one. I ain't gonna blow anymore. And therein lies the problem. Not only that, but once again, I've got China at my back. That, of course, was the
Yeah.
other main element of February of 2022, where Xi Jinping pretty much gave Putin nihil obstat, kind of go ahead. Yeah, okay, we really love Westphalia, but we see that your core interests are threatened. We see that you understand this is this is an existential threat. We face the same thing out in Taiwan. We know that we're next. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're with you. Now, if Blinken finally has gotten into his head that that's the reality, the Russians and the Chinese are joined at the hip. Well, I hope he will finally understand that, come back and tell Joe Biden, look, we're bit off a little bit more or a lot more than we can chew. Let's find a deal here in Ukraine before there's no deal to be had.
Ray, you mentioned that Putin's under some hardline pressure, or shall we just say, pressure from his own folks. I take it you saw the situation with Wagner, because what Putin and the defense ministry are saying now is that everyone fighting with Wagner has to sign a contract and be fully integrated into the Russian army. And Prigozhin is kind of saying, no way. He's said it. He said no one is going to sign anything. What did you think of all this tension between him and Wagner?
It was a Wagnerian opera, actually, wasn't it? With Prigozhin, the main singer. I have to admit, I don't know. when people ask me, is Putin firm in the saddle? I said 95% yes, 5% Prigozhin. I don't know how he's allowed to get away with all this stuff. Many people say,
Yeah.
well, now that Putin finds him useful I don't know. I can't figure it out. So Prigozhin, I think, has some political ambitions. It's not 100% clear that Putin will run again. I think it probably will. But who knows? Prigozhin is a
Yeah.
real slippery character. And I just confess that I don't have a really good guess how to explain what he's been allowed to do.
Honestly, it made me think of Sudan. You know, you had Dungalo, who was with his rapid strike forces. Technically, within the army, but not really. So a bit like Wagner with the Russian military. And then, now the situation in Sudan is it's spiraled out of control, right? So he had political ambitions, it seems, and yeah, I mean.
Yeah.
Obviously, only wishing the best for Sudan and likewise for Russia because they need to be stable. I know this is said a lot, and I say it a lot because I do think it's a real threat. But do you think that the we are closer to nuclear war with Russia than ever before? Would you agree that it's worse than in the Cold War?
Yes. And for good or ill, I would remind folks that I decided to major in Russian in 1958. Now I've been with it more than 6 decades, on and off, but almost always on. Uh, it's been my fixation. I think that Russia's turn to the east is a lamentable phenomenon, given that Peter the Great saw Russia's future in the West, that he tried to break through a window to Europe, right? Pushkin's poem. And that things seem to be going pretty well with ups and downs, but Russia has always seen itself mostly as a European power. And that means a lot when you think of how they've been demeaned by people like Obama and what's his name, McCain, right? Russia
Yeah.
is just a gas station posing as a country, right? Right. So here's the image, Look at this gas station here. Hey, Pushkin, you finish that oil change yet? Dostoevsky, get your head out of that book here and help me change these tires.
It's really the attitude.
I mean,
It's really on
yeah.
point.
And so they've always been feeling like they're second cousins at best, even though some of their royalty intermarried. But here's the thing. If you know a modicum of Russian history, you know that they had an experience unlike any experience we had in Europe, right? And that was
Yeah.
2 centuries plus 40 years under what they call the Tatarskaya Iga. That means the Tartar yoke. That means Genghis Khan. That means for 240 years, they had to be ruled by these very cruel people from the Eastern steppes. It was only when they came out of that, okay, about 1440 or so. Now, the West was coming out of the Dark Ages. They were coming into the Renaissance, right? Okay. And so the Russians were 2+ centuries behind then and have been doing double step since then to catch up. Now, have they caught up? Well, listen to Rachmaninoff, for God's sake. Listen to Tchaikovsky. Read Pushkin. Read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. Yeah, they caught up right quick. Are they as talented as any other nationality? Of course they are. And if I'm betraying a love for Russian literature or a love for Russian culture, well, I have that love, and to see that sacrifice as a byproduct of this
It's
crazy
sickening.
war in Ukraine is really very painful for me. And I try to get beyond that when I'm doing the facts, when I'm looking at the at empirical situation. But that too, I have to confess, is very hurtful and really deleterious for the culture of the world when push comes to shove.
Yeah, yeah, it's, I mean, absolute madness. You know, I saw the Czech president the other day saying that all Russian nationals in the West should be placed under, basically, they should be spied on. You know, he called it the strict security regime. He even referred to the internment camps that the Japanese were put in the United States. He said that, and you know, it's like they're demonizing everything from Russian nationals to Russian literature to Russian culture, all of it. It's I mean, to call it stupidity is an understatement. It's much more than that. I mean, if we're gonna do that to the Russians because of what's happening in Ukraine, then, you know, there should be no English or American athletes allowed to compete anywhere, or any Anglo-Saxon music or literature or anything. We should ban all of it then, if that's the standard, right?
Yeah, and I stopped at the Renaissance, but if you take Hitler, if you take Napoleon, if you take what the Russians have suffered in
Yeah.
war, okay, we have not had that experience. We've been protected by two very big oceans, right? And the people we have running our policy have absolutely zero experience in war. The only person that can claim some experience is that fellow Lloyd Austin that I mentioned before, who falsifies the intelligence now. Okay, so take Blinken, take Biden. Now, Biden was around. I mean, he's only a couple of years younger than me, right? He was around during Vietnam. Do you know how many deferments he had, Richard?
I'm guessing more than one.
Can you count them? 5. Okay. How many did Dick Cheney have? I use a left hand for Cheney. 5. Okay.
Yeah, funny
they never
how they
wore
never
a uniform,
fight.
for God's.
Yeah, funny that
They never wore. I mean, I don't know if they're Boy Scouts or not, but they never wore a uniform. So you're a Russian, right? You come out of that experience. 26 million Russians, Soviets, we'll call them, killed during World War II. That's not just the military, that's all Soviet citizens, okay? Now, how many do we have in the US? Well, 440,000. 440,000 against 26 million. And all of ours, of course, were soldiers. And we didn't have any deficit, just except for Pearl Harbor, we didn't have any destruction. So there's a big gap there. And as the Russians look at us, they say, my God, not only are these guys threatening us, trying to put our back to the wall, but they don't have any idea what fighting is like. Look what they're getting their Ukrainian people to do. I mean, for God's sake, we can handle that, say the Russians. But do we have to keep killing these guys to make them have some sense? So there's the notion that every Russian family, if I can, I want to. Do we have another 4 minutes or so?
Take all the time, please.
I was in Yalta with a small citizens delegation on the anniversary of the German attack on the Soviet Union, and it was about 8 years ago, 8 years ago or so, and there were people there. We didn't know it, but there were all kinds of people there for a very big celebration memorial. Okay, almost all those people, some of them were as old as I was, had somebody killed in World War II. And we were visiting the delegation. We were the first Americans to visit Yalta since the Ukrainian coup that we arranged. And so they said, well, would somebody say something? So I said, yeah, I'll say something. And I remembered a poem that seemed appropriate for the circumstances by the Russian poet Nikolai Nekrasov, who is appropriately called the poet of Russian grief. Okay. And this is the poem. It's very short. Внимая ужасом войны is what it's called. And ужас, it's almost like onomatopoeia, right? Ужас is the horrors, awful stuff about war, okay? Внимая, paying attention to the ужасом войны, the horrors of war. Внимая ужасом войны, при каждой новой жертве боя, мне жаль не друга, не жены, мне жаль не самого героя. Увы, утешится жена и друга, лучший друг забудет. Где-то есть душа одна, она до гроба помнить будет. Лицемерных насистел и всякой пошлости и прозы. Одни я в мире подсмотрел, святые, искренние слезы, то слезы бедных матерей. Им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой Ниве, как не понять плохуши своих поникнувших ветвей. Paying attention to the horrors of war and each new victim of the battle, I feel sorry not so much for the hero, not for his wife or his friends, not even for the hero himself. I feel sorry for the sincere tears, the uniquely sincere tears of бедных матерей, of the poor mothers. Им не забыть своих детей. They don't forget their children, погибших на кровавой Ниве, who perish on the field of battle. Как не поднять плохую шаиве своих поникнувших ветвей, just as a weeping willow tree can never actually raise its branches.
Wow.
This today's Father's Day, all right? And I kid with my kids. They congratulate me. We have 5 kids, and I say, I couldn't have done it without your mom. No, that doesn't go over well with mom. But the idea is, it's the mothers that do the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
The mothers that bear the real scars. And how many mothers, Ukrainian mothers, are now having to weep and will not be able to raise their arms, just like a weeping willow can never raise its branches.
Yeah, I mean that was very beautiful, right? Thank you for sharing that poem with us and saying it in Russian. And I only know a few words, but I'm happy you translated it. It's a very sad poem, and I agree with you, because at the end of the day, these people like Dick Cheney or Tony Blinken, they don't actually sacrifice anything or do anything. They're all the way in Washington, and especially if you're in the States, you got 2 oceans on one ocean on either side. So I feel like they don't even grasp what war is. They have no clue. It's in England, we had the Blitz. So, my grandmother, she was hit by a V1. She survived though, thankfully. And my grandfather fought in the RAF, and in the UK took World War II took a heavy toll on the UK. But it's only when I'm growing up, when I became an adult, I finally understood what the Russians had to go through, because we always talk about D-Day in the US and the UK and Canada, and that's all good. And there's a lot done there, but I never understood until I was an adult how much the Russians, and it's not just the Russians, by the way, it's like the entire Soviet Union, how much they gave. 27 million people, like you said, it's enormous. It's absolutely, mind-boggling. And we're still chipping away at them. And that's just cruel. It's just cruel that we have foreign policy like this.
Hey, Richard, you said 27 million. I think the most precise figure, latest I've seen, is 26,400,000. Now, why do I say 26 million? Because that's what Putin says. So those of you who accuse Putin of exaggerating, well, it's
Yeah.
just the opposite. He comes
Right.
down on the conservative side of things. He's
Right.
willing to round off 400,000. Wow, that's what we suffered. U.S. 400,000 plus. Okay. That's a round off figure. He'll say 26,000. Just try to wrap your mind around that, will you? I mean, I was a little kid. I was alive during the whole of World War II. I saw the little lights in the mother's windows there of people who had perished, of people who were in the service and all that stuff. And I waited in line for a quarter of a pound of butter, but we didn't suffer very much. We kind of relied on those 400,000 who perished, plus all the people who fought valiantly. But when push comes to shove, very few Americans realized that Russia won that damn war. Did
Yeah.
we help? Yeah, we helped. I mean, a little vignette, okay? I'm in Russia about, 6 years ago now, and I'm at a celebration of the meeting on the Elbe when U.S. and Russian forces finally met after years on the Elbe River in what used to be East Germany, right? Okay, so
Right.
we're celebrating that, and I said that I recited that poem, and and then a general came up to me in a Soviet Army uniform. He's about 6'4". He had his full thing on, and he looked down at me. I'm only 5'11", 5'10" now. Okay, and he said, "Studebaker, Studebaker, Studebaker," and he gave me this great big Russian bear hug. And I'm saying, "Oh my God, Lend-Lease!" Now, Americans don't know that the Studebaker factory in Indiana turned all its war production over to what we in the Army used to call deuce and a halfs, right? 2.5-ton trucks. And what happened to them? 200,000 of them were produced. Where'd they go? A large share of them through Iran up into the Soviet Union at the time. Uh, General Adamov was in the infantry. He was there to receive these deuce and a halfs. They were able to go through incredible terrain to
Yeah.
take artillery pieces, take troops, whatever. Okay,
But they
and he
don't
was
mention
saying
that
to
now.
me,
They
"No,
don't mention that when they gave the Ukraine this new lend-lease. They didn't mention that the Soviet Union was the second largest recipient. They just mentioned the UK. It's like they're rewriting history.
yeah."
Incredible.
But it was so moving, this great big general, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
he didn't know any English, but he knew Studebaker. And my God, that was such a revealing moment. And that's what, Americans need to know. Studebaker and how we helped the Russians, but it was the Russians that had already turned back the Germans, for God's sake. I mean, they had
Yeah.
already won the war with our help, of course. But when Normandy was great, but it wasn't the turning point of the war. And that's not to disparage the bravery that happened in Normandy.
Of
And
course not.
surely,
Yeah.
I can't be sure the Russians would have won, but had they won, it would have taken another year or so. They would be all the way on the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And, I don't necessarily think that would have been a good thing either. So, if people don't know history, that's what really, really gets me. They don't
Yeah.
know about the
It's a shame.
Tatarskaya Iga. They don't know how Russia has always felt like a second-class citizen, despite Tchaikovsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin. So this isn't a background, but it's very much in play now. And I
It
think,
is.
and I'll say this, that Putin has been very circumspect, has been very much the statesman, and not being provoked any more than he was provoked in attacking Ukraine. I think that the notion that it was unprovoked is really crazy and indefensible. That it was illegal, well, yet let the lawyers argue about that. did he have any other choice? I've been going around and about with other people of various persuasions. We say, "Oh no, sure he had other choices." I said, "Oh, give me a for instance." Like, I come from the Bronx, right? Okay, we used to give a for instance, right? Give me an example. The best example people serve up. Well, Putin could have threatened nuclear war if they didn't, right? Or, well, he could have studied Gandhi a little bit more. Well, that would have been nice. I mean,
Oh
hello,
man.
he had no choice. We gave him no choice, and people don't understand that. Uh, and we can prove it. It's just that they've been brainwashed, and we
Yep.
need, you mentioned the mainstream media. That's where you come in, Richard, and that's why I'm privileged, I feel today, to spend part of Father's Day just trying to give out some information that I feel I maybe uniquely have in terms of my
Yes.
experience in Russian analysis. And so
Thank you.
it's our job, really, and we can't be discouraged. Discouraged is not allowed. Disgusted,
Yeah.
that's allowed, but discouraged not. So thanks for the opportunity for me to share these thoughts with you.
No, the pleasure is all mine, and just so I don't keep you too long. I just thought as a last question because China was a victor of World War II. That's why they have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. What do you think of how we're preparing to go to war with China with this AUKUS alliance and provoking them with Taiwan? Do you think that we're going to end up in the same place we are with the Russians now, or that this is somehow inevitable?
Well, I forget whether I said this before, but Putin has said that it's crazy for the U.S. to be running the risk of a two-front war. And I think Putin is quite correct in that. As we speak, Tony Blinken is getting up in the morning to face the second day talking with the Chinese leaders. And it all really depends on whether Tony Blinken can wrap his mind around the fact that he badly advised the president 2 years ago, almost to the date, right? 2 years ago in Geneva, June 16th, 2021, the one-on-one face-to-face summit between Biden and Putin.
Right.
Now, what we know about that is what Biden shared right after it. He said, I'm not, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to say what I told President Putin, but, he has this thousands of miles of border with China. And he knows that China aspires to be not only the most powerful economic, but powerful military country in the world. He's being squeezed. He's being squeezed by China. He's got this real problem on his hand. Now, I don't know. I wasn't a fly on the wall when Putin, after he watched that on the tube, looked at his advisors and said, "Huh? Where are these guys getting this?" They were getting it from the textbooks they read at Columbia and Harvard, some chapters of which I wrote when Russia and China were at loggerheads, when Kissinger and Nixon were smart enough to exploit that. We thought, and that was my portfolio, we thought that they'd hate each other forever. Not so.
Right. Things change.
When you have a common enemy, you have a different perspective, okay? So that was 2 years and 2 days ago. Is Blinken able to realize now that the bipolar world or the unipolar world is dead? That it's really silly to talk about U.S. exceptionalism? That he can't talk to his opposite Chinese numbers with a feeling of arrogance, as though he were one of those British sailing up the Yangtze River there during the century of humiliation? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. These guys are born with silver spoons in their mouth. They go to the best schools. They're the best and the brightest. They have really nice shoes on. Okay.
They should
Can
be
they
better
bring themselves?
they should be better than everyone, and they act, they behave like the worst. It's
Well, it's
shocking.
actually so they think they're better than everyone, but they don't know any real life. One
Yeah.
aspect, of course, is they never served in the service. So, if Lincoln adopts the attitude of, for example, John Kirby, okay, he's the National Security Council, the White House National Security spokesperson. So
Yeah.
he gets up 6 days ago and he says, "These reports of China setting up spy bases in Cuba. Well, it just reminds me. It reminds me that from day one we have looked at Chinese activities in our Western Hemisphere with great concern."
How do you think Russia feels then in their hemisphere?
Well, he's in China now. Will his opposite numbers say, "Tony, we've been watching your activities in our hemisphere,
Uh-huh.
and we look at them from day one with great concern." I mean, hello, they've got to hit this guy on the head like that proverbial donkey with a
Yeah.
thing, with a block. So I don't know how it will come out, but I think I like to hope that with Ukraine going down the drain, that even Biden and Blinken and Sullivan, maybe not Newland, but maybe a majority of those three incompetents can bring themselves to realize that it really is crazy to take on a two-front war. That maybe, if not Austin and maybe Milley or somebody else will say, we agree, we don't want to really get involved in it. We're not really prepared to do it. Well, actually, we're not prepared to one more war in Europe, okay? So maybe the sense will break in, but every
Hopefully.
time I say that, the opposite comes true. And
Mm.
I just think that maybe this time it will come true because I see the Russians moving all the way to the Dnieper River in Ukraine and saying, okay, now will you talk? Odessa would be willing to deal. Odessa, it's on the other bank of the Dnieper. You need Odessa to have a viable country. You need an outlet to the sea, or else you become just a big farm for the rest of Europe. So we can deal with Odessa, but we need a cordon sanitaire. We need some sort of a buffer zone here to make sure that your long-range weaponry doesn't wreak havoc on our provinces that used to be part of Ukraine. So, yeah, I hope that they will see that light, and I dare say that if it's the opposite, if they up the ante, send those F-16s, and they get involved in an open war between NATO and Russia, then you're going to see some real saber rattling, at least in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. Mark my words, this will be saber rattling and perhaps even more as we fly these reconnaissance flights and push these warships through the Taiwan Strait. So they want a two-front war. Well, I hope it doesn't come to that. But they're going to have to wake up. They're going to have to really kind of be chastised and realize that, hey, the unipolar world really and truly is gone. Wake up and smell the coffee.
I mean, that incident with the ship about 2 weeks ago where you had a Chinese ship cutting them off and they try to play the victim, the Canadians and the American Navy. I mean, that, it doesn't take much to start a war than to lie about these things. Gulf of Tonkin comes to mind, but I mean, let's not exaggerate either. But yeah, it's a two-front war. I mean, I thought that's the last thing anyone wants in the military. These people, they're running on empty.
You think? Yeah. When you look at well, you have to. I guess my one advantage is I got these decades of experience watching Russia and China. China used to, back in the 60s and 70s, they used to issue warnings, and they really didn't appreciate how silly it looked to the West. But they would issue our 204th serious warning about your ships coming close to our shore. Now at this, the 214th serious warning. They do about 250 a year, okay? It looked really silly. They don't do that anymore. They don't even apologize for cutting off our ships. They're feeling their oats just as the Russians are. I just hope that they will have some kind of meeting of the minds before push comes to shove and there's an incident of some kind, because it's altogether possible that will happen. After all, you got these hotshots on both sides, presumably, that wouldn't mind colliding with a ship or an aircraft. And then the balloon will go up, and I don't mean this balloon that we shot down.
The spy balloon, right?
Over the Atlantic, right? Let's just hope and pray that what we call them, the realities in the world, the real what's going on there in Ukraine and elsewhere will have a sobering influence on our guys. It's just so that they realize that, hey, we ought to end this before the presidential campaign really gets underway, so that Joe Biden doesn't feel like he has to be a war hero to be reelected president.
Ray, last question, I promise. You said you lived in Germany for a while. Did you ever go to Vienna? Do you have any spy stories from Vienna? Given how it was in the Cold War.
Yeah, I could sing a song about Vienna. I love Vienna. But do I have any spy stories from Vienna? None that I have any personal involvement in. Actually, I could tell you if I did, but I was an analyst even when I was overseas. In a word, in the 60s, I was posted to Radio Free Europe liaison, so that what happened in the Hungarian Revolution would not happen when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia. I was convinced that was going to happen. There was a lot of euphoria. No, Dubček, Prague Spring. Oh, we got those Russians right over a barrel. I kind of knew that it was just a matter of time. And so in August of 1968, it was no surprise to me or to the head, the director of Radio Free Europe, that the Russians invaded. My job was to make sure that the U.S. did not encourage, as we had encouraged the Hungarians, to rise up and get themselves killed. In other words, we regretted what we gave the Hungarians to believe with respect to the support that would come from the United States back in 1956. We didn't want that to happen again. So I had a pretty key role in making sure that they had good intelligence as to how far the Russians really wanted to go. Would they take Romania? No way. Those were bizarre. So I had intelligence to cool tempers and to give a real perspective as to what to expect. Lamentable as it was, and as sad as it was to hear the strains of El Moldau, Smetana, on the last radio station 3 days into the invasion before it got closed down. So that's what I was doing in the 60s and the 70s. I was a liaison to the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German federal, the German counterpart to the CIA. I was in charge of substantive liaison with the German government from an intelligence point of view, and I had not only CIA but Army, Air Force, Navy, NSA people who I had titular authority over. and who we kind of made sure that the BND had the best of the intelligence that we could share with them, and in return, we got a lot of good intelligence on East Germany and other places like that. So it was still an analyst position, and I very much appreciated it and found myself really learning a lot about the German people. Last thing I'll say is that we had a lot of visitors in Germany. I had the privilege of going to five Oktoberfests. And we usually had a visitor for every day of those Oktoberfests, right? Okay. So what did I do at the end of any visit to Munich? We went to Dachau, whether the visitor wanted to go to Dachau or not. Enough said.
Ray, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for all of your time and all of your insight. And it's RayMcGovern.com, right? That's where people can follow your work.
Right. Thanks, Richard. Mm-hmm.
Okay, RayMcGovern.com. I'll pull it up on the screen in just a moment. And again, I'm very grateful for having you on. Thank you very much, Ray. Everybody, Ray McGovern. They want to know.
Yeah, well, spread the word now, Richard. Make sure that everybody who hears this shares it with their friends, because we have a really big educational challenge before us.
Yes. Yeah, we do. That's I feel like the education system in the West and the media, they've abandoned and abdicated their duties to inform people.
Yeah, that's where you come in, man. So keep up the good work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Oh, well,
that's French.
This is Ray's website for anyone who wants to follow his work. It's RayMcGovern.com. Again, thank you very much, Ray. I appreciate it. Take care.
Most welcome, Richard. You take care too. Bye.